All right, welcome to the SIG Auth meeting for June 13th, 2018. Looks like a smaller crowd today. I know we have stuff wrapping up for 111, and we have some folks who weren't able to make it, but we'll run through the agenda and see if there's time for anything else or end early. So just to recap for 111, work is closing out. Code freeze was last week. Everything on our side seems pretty quiet. The things that we had targeted either made it in or we've already decided will slip to 112. I know there was a call in the Slack channel for folks to look at themes. The docs team is putting together release notes, and so they're looking to gather themes from SIG Auth by Friday. So if you want to jump in to look at that, I'll put a link in the agenda once we get off this. Yeah, just take a look at that. If you have feedback or suggestions or think something was missed, I want to make sure that people know what we did. Other than that, there haven't been any test issues, no flaky tests, no test failures that we're responsible for, so that's great. Are there any other announcements, things for the release closing out that people wanted to bring up? All right. We don't have any demos today, and nobody put any new polls in the agenda. I know there's some existing ones that slipped 111 that we're hoping to get in pretty early in 112, but yeah, nothing new that anyone called out. So with that, we can move on to discussion. So it's funny, I think Tim wasn't actually able to make it today, so it might just be me. So I get to recap this for everyone. So if you saw Eric's message to the group, he's actually moving on to a different project, and so he's going to be stepping down from SIG Auth chair and actually probably handing over maintenance a lot of the sub-projects that he has been involved in for Kubernetes. So as part of that, we are looking to specifically replace his chair role. And so we kind of described what that role entails and opened up a call for people to volunteer if they were interested or had a recommendation for someone else who was interested. So like I said in the email, we're looking to have a recommendation. We're hoping to by the end of this week. There hasn't been much activity there. So if you're interested, please let us know, just so we have a good sense for who would be available. As it says in our proposed charter, we prefer to spread involvement out between companies, between different groups. But if the people who are interested end up being from the same company and there don't seem to be other options, we may end up with more than one person from the same company. So again, if you're interested or know someone who would be interested, you can jump through into that topic and send us an email with details. All right. Were there any questions about that before we move on to the next topic? All right. Matt or Patrick, one of you want to take the next?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I swear through this on the agenda. This is really just an open-ended discussion topic. We have this dynamic audit KEP sort of under discussion right now. And one of the issues that came up in that KEP is we want to dynamically configure API servers with a webhook. And we already have this kind of thing with mutating webhooks right now. We would like to find a way to let the API server, and there might be multiple API servers, authenticate to the webhook server. And that's sort of hard to do right now with the dynamic webhook configurations. So one option I thought about there, and I wanted to kind of throw this out to the group, is this could be a use case for bound service account tokens. So you could, in your dynamic webhook configuration, basically tell the API server, hey, go out and get a service account token bound to this audience and use that to authenticate to this webhook server. So I thought it was interesting, maybe because it's the first kind of first-party use case we would have for bound service account tokens. I just wanted to throw that out and see if anybody had any thoughts or objections.
So when you say like go out and get a token, frequently the API servers, like the extension API servers, are running in pods, right? So they're already running kind of in the cluster. As such, it would be possible to inject in tokens for various audiences. Are you the reaching out and getting a token versus like when you provision the API server mounting in a token? What, I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I guess I'm also thinking about cases where the control plane is not sort of self-hosted like that, where maybe the API server is running in a hosted solution. You still want to be able to dynamically tell the API server how to authenticate back to your webhook receiver, but you don't necessarily have control to like inject files into the API server's container. There's other solutions here. I think there's a little bit of discussion in the KEP. Like other solutions here might be pointing to a secret that has a static token or pointing to a secret that has TLS credentials.
Yeah, for the kind of many to many type of interactions,
yeah,
like assuming that all of the API servers that are going to look at this config and be responsible for calling this webhook config have uniform access to credentials seemed like an assumption we didn't want to bake in.
I agree. Yeah.
So like I'm not sure about it reaching out and getting a token. I think it could be interesting to identify an audience, maybe. I don't know, Mike. Had you thought about associating audiences with some of the targets for API calls that various things we're going to have to make?
Right now, correct me if I'm wrong, the webhook extension is just unauthenticated, right?
No. So when you start up the API server, you can give it a credential set that it uses when determining the credentials to talk to various webhooks.
So it uses a kubeconfig for the webhooks that are programmed in. But what about for webhook extensions?
Yeah, there's no way to dynamically plug in more credentials.
Yeah, it's not dynamic. So that kubeconfig has to contain the credentials you want for the various destinations.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting. I'd be a little concerned on how we lock down audiences, because at that point, anybody who can create an API extension or
they could request a token for a random audience and it would automatically get fulfilled. Yeah.
Whereas client TLS authentication doesn't.
An alternative could be that the DNS name that it is using to call the webhook is the audience that it requests a token for. So if my webhook is foobar.com, if we were going to go down the route of using service account tokens for this, and typically audience corresponds to the network name. That's not uncommon, and that kind of is a protection for if you control this DNS name, then I guess you're allowed to get stuff for that audience. We'd have to think about it more, but it's definitely interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. That's pretty much the extent of this topic, so we can move on.
Okay.
Well, is there a place that any of this discussion is happening that could be linked to?
Let's I guess continue discussion in the dynamic auditing KEP. That's sort of the driving issue for this.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Patrick, you want to summarize or ask questions or kind of pull out what you wanted for the dynamic audit bit for this meeting?
Yeah, so we've been around on it a couple times. There's been a ton of participation, and thank you to everybody who's gotten involved. So we've kind of reworked it. We've done some iteration cycles internally as well. What we've come to now is essentially two objects. One would be like a cluster level audit configuration, and one would be a namespace audit configuration. The idea of getting past privilege escalation would be that you could still configure it on the master node and just point a flag to, one of these object files on the node. That would always run. You wouldn't have to worry about privilege escalation, getting up to cluster admin and somehow tampering with that to cover their tracks. But then you could still have cluster level audit configurations happening independently of that file that's configured on the master node. And likewise, you would have configurations that could happen independently within the namespaces. And then also thinking there was the idea floated that we may need a root policy that could override any of these. And I think internally our thinking is, if you have access to, admin access to whatever domain, whether it be, cluster admin or just admin access within the namespace, you should be able to really configure that auditing entirely because you already have access to all the secrets. You should be able to tell it if you want to log secrets or whatnot to be able to do that. But having that static file provisioned on the node still allows you to, ensure that at least that set of webhooks or file logs won't be tampered with and is guaranteed. I don't know if that makes sense. I just pushed up the commit for the cap, so I imagine it's quite a bit to think through, but wanted to kind of get general thoughts if anyone has them, immediately.
How do you want to handle the override semantics between the cluster and the namespace? So when you have the cluster admin says, everything needs to be logged, can namespaces override that and say, no, I don't want logging?
So with the current method I'm putting out there today, they would just be independent of one another. So you would have a cluster level scoped audit configuration. You could log all of everything everywhere if you wanted to, and that would send out to whatever webhooks are defined in that configuration. The namespace level one would just operate independently, but it would only have rights over the namespace actions.
Sure.
You could send that out to whatever, and you can log whatever level you'd like there.
But that means that at the cluster level, you cannot enforce audit logging for all namespaces, right? So say if the cluster is running some compliance workloads.
No, you would still be able to. So they'd actually be independent processes. So if at the cluster level, I define a policy that says log all namespaces and all actions, request response, and then in, say, my namespace, I have a separate configuration that says, hey, only log config map changes. Why you'd ever want that, I don't know, and send them to these webhooks. Those would be independent processes. So it's not as though the namespace one would override the cluster one. They would just operate independently.
Okay, so that is essentially an or. If either one requires audit logging, it would happen.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Then you have another problem. What if you have a service account that whose access you don't want logged because it was just spam the logs? This is a trusted part of my service, so I don't want to see any of that. How can
you can already opt out. The rules are evaluated in order, and if you look at the default audit policy for GCE, it opts out some noisy actors.
Yeah.
So it sounds like what you're describing is like what we currently have, where you have a static kind of non-overridable config that logs to a destination, either a file or a webhook, and that can be put in place by the cluster administrator, and it can do what it does today, and nothing overrides it, nothing interferes with it. And then separately, these dynamic configs, which are optionally subject to constraints that the cluster admin puts in place. So the cluster admin could say, dynamic configs may not log X, Y, or Z, no matter how much they want to. Does that capture?
No, if you have the rights to create an audit configuration, you would just have the right to do that. There would be no way of saying, hey, you can't log anything. It would just be assumed that if you're given that right, say you're a cluster admin, that you already have access to all that sensitive information. You can send it wherever you want. You then have rights to enable this process as well.
Even for the dynamic ones?
Yeah, yep. I understand that might be a little controversial because I know some people are wanting the ability for the cluster admin to set like hard barriers. At least the feedback I got internally was it would just be too confusing to have like an inherited type policy coming down.
Okay, so I guess I'm not seeing the 3 levels. This seems like static things that we already have and dynamic things which are independent. What was the kind of root thing that you were describing?
I abandoned that after some internal feedback, just that people thought it was
okay.
levels, it was too confusing. So I'm sorry, it's changed recently. So now it is just 2 levels, similar to cluster role binding and role binding, that kind of approach.
But if you keep the static one, isn't the static one essentially the root? So you have a static one, and then you have the dynamic one at the cluster level, and then you have a dynamic audit configuration at the namespace level.
I think it's just non-overridable. Like getting access to the API wouldn't let you monkey with those rules, and so you can count on it always being in effect.
Yes. That is it. Okay, good.
Yep.
But that still wouldn't allow you to say, so if at the cluster level we say access by service account needs to be logged in whatever fashion, and at the namespace level I identify a specifically noisy service account that I don't want logged, I couldn't express that, right?
Yeah, you're not affecting cluster level policies. Yeah. So if something is noisy, then whoever has audit policies that capture those noisy events needs to exclude those noisy events.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the ask from the namespace level is really more multi-tenant environments where you just wouldn't have access up to that cluster level objects, and you could, define, say you wanted, independent auditing features to go out for your namespaces, you'd be able to define those there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's we've just kind of pushed up the changes. Obviously, it's kind of a lot to digest and think through, but just wanted to give heads up that they're there. So.
Okay. I know the split between like cluster scoped and namespace scoped. There's been some discussion about that approach in there's a scheduler policy proposal, and all of these kind of policy proposal frequently touch on similar concepts. And the statement has been made that we want to see if there are ways to avoid that kind of awkward 2 objects that do the same thing but at different scopes. I'm not sure if avoiding that is good or bad, but that's been brought up in the scheduler proposal. So we probably want to be consistent with whatever we did. I think the comment there, I think it was Brian Grant, was saying, if we want to have something that rules the cluster, let's make a namespace for it and give that namespace access to have cluster scope policies. That becomes more of an ACL check, like at the point when you define the policy, the decision has to be made, can this namespace have policies that log things up across the whole cluster? It's a little trickier to reason about.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, but I did want to bring that up, that we want to probably be coherent. whichever
Another,
direction we go.
another concern is if every policy decides to handle it slightly differently.
Yep.
Right? So we have one policy that allows overriding, another one that doesn't. So would SIG policy kind of decide the higher level semantics there?
We have been like trying to keep up with all the policy proposals and commenting. I try really hard. And
We need a policy proposal policy.
I have one kind of, but
Yeah.
so yeah, I think we already left comments on the dynamic audit configuration to like around some of the similar terms and ideas for just like little things. But of course, there are still like unanswered questions of how we want to do policy in general that we should discuss at the working group.
Is there any way you could link me out to some of the stuff, some of the issues you all are referencing so I can track them?
Yeah.
Can someone else grab that link and throw it in the doc? All right. Well, we will keep iterating on this and keep trying to harmonize that with the other approaches that are being discussed as well.
Cool.
All right, Mike, you're up.
Yeah, so I'm here on behalf of Vish, who is working on basically a graceful termination daemon, which will on some of our it's GCP specific, but essentially what we want to be able to do is we have GPU type machines that are not migratable, and we can send notifications of imminent migration or imminent rescheduling to the VM, and how that manifests as a VM restart. We want to be able to gracefully stop applications, and we do that by sending them SIG terms from a daemon set process. As part of that, when we receive that termination notification, we also want to set a taint on the node object. Recently, we restricted nodes from setting their own taints. I think this is a correct long-term solution, and I was on board with this change, so I am playing devil's advocate here. But the proposed solutions for this type of integration add complexity to components that need to do this. So I'm curious about how general of an issue this is. Do we see more daemon set components potentially wanting to add taints to the node object, or are these so few that we should solve them in integration specific controllers? And then the devil's advocate opinion is conditions are unnecessary indirections. Well-known key prefixes are hard since they are vendor specific taints. So the elegance of the actual taint keys is potentially hampered by a single key prefix. Updating node controller is probably equivalently as hard as adding configuration to the admission controller. So
my question would be, what is intended to remove or update this taint?
The daemon set is intended to add and remove this taint.
Okay.
The other thing is, I don't know if it still holds true, but about 3 years ago, Brian Grant said that we should not willy-nilly use conditions. They should be tightly curated and potentially only defined in core. I'll send a link to that comment. I'm not sure if his thinking has changed, but I think it would be interesting to hash this out with him.
Yeah.
So this issue discusses removing phases from the API, and also simplifying taints or simplifying conditions. One comment by Brian was conditions aren't annotations that can't be added by just any entity. They should be curated. And conditions are for programmatic consumption. For instance, the ready condition is used to remove pods from endpoints. I think the first comment is a potentially an argument against using conditions, and the second comment is potentially hints that we are using conditions for the right reason here, because we are using it them for program consumption.
You're a terrible devil's advocate. You're arguing both sides. That's.
I know. I really want this change, but I also want to. I think this is a reasonable requirement.
Is there? So it seems like we're trying to use one mechanism, which is taints, for at least two purposes, maybe three. One is a way to fence off nodes that are bad for some reason, right? Like this node is compromised, or this node doesn't meet XYZ security standard, or like we want to keep workloads off this node for some reason. And we definitely don't want the node being able to unfence itself or opt back in or say, no, actually, I totally do meet those security standards. So and then the second type of use is like a central controller that knows things about the node from like a cloud provider or something outside the node. And so it is setting taints and removing taints. And it's probably not a security issue, but like if the node messed with those, it would probably break stuff, right? And then the third is local knowledge on the kubelet about custom things, or even some of the things that are currently conditions that are being translated into taints. And so I feel like we're missing kind of a principled way to decide what falls into those three buckets and keep those three uses possible.
Where does dedication fall? Does that fall in the first one?
I think so, yeah. So like this, this, would you use it for as a taint? Probably so. Tainted for this tenant, only things that tolerate that tenant go to that node.
The combination of taints and labels.
You'd probably label and taint, yeah.
Yeah, with some restriction on who can set specific taints.
So like I said, there are several solutions that we could pursue, and I'm not opposed to using taints for these kind of node local knowledge purposes. I just, based on history, I know that if you start getting use in a particular way, you will never ever root that use out or limit it, or it's like pulling teeth. So are you saying that the last option that I mentioned, which is describe the taints you're going to let the node manage, is what we have to do?
Well, so I think it depends on. I would like to hear Brian's take on that, and if he sees that this falls, conditions are acceptably used in this way, then I would probably go with option 3. Otherwise, I think I would go with option 4. I think option 4 is more painful from an implementation perspective, because diffing to lists of taints is actually not really trivial, and we have to do it on every update of the
Right. Yep.
Whereas if we did it in option 3, I think it could be potentially easier and less expensive. Yeah.
I mean, part of the admission plugin config pane is that it's static. So anytime you want to change it or view it, you know, it's a file on the API server. Would it, I mean, I don't like mixing policy into objects. Now we're back to a policy conversation, but like describing what taints are allowed. Well, yeah, diffing taints is really painful, especially, I don't think we would get super fine grained. I think it would just be like, this taint is allowed to be managed by the node, not this taint with this value, but not that value, or this effect, but not that effect. Like that becomes insane. Okay. Yeah.
I think probably the most expedient solution is option 1. The pain around that is it just adds another component to our masters, and it's not particularly elegant, and we can't sustainably add a process per extension for the rest of the future. Just
is
management nightmare.
So here's a thought. We already have a controller that is translating conditions into taints, right?
Yeah.
We also have basically 3 effects that taints can have. You know, no schedule, no execute, and prefer no schedule, I think. What if nodes could indicate, and right now the controller that is translating conditions into taints is 1-to-1, right? Like it looks at one condition, not ready or whatever, and translates that into a no schedule.
Right.
What if multiple conditions could feed into that taint?
A single taint that says
no. So are the taints that you are needing to deal with just generic don't schedule stuff on me taints, or are they very specific, like don't schedule this type of workload on me? Maybe I'm misunderstanding the use case.
For this specific use case, it's don't schedule on me. I think we just want to trigger just a graceful eviction.
Yeah. So if some of the existing taints, like the not ready or whatever, not ready, network unavailable, some of those existing ones, we're just looking for additional conditions that would inform those taints instead of it being 1-to-1. And those additional conditions could be set by some extra thing running on some daemon set running on the kubelet. Then figuring out a way to describe that would keep you from having to write a custom condition to taint controller. It would just expand the power of the current one, so that things with set conditions, the thing that translates those into taints would, we would give kubelets the power to say any one of these 5 conditions means I should have a not ready taint on me. That might be interesting. I don't think it would solve everything, especially if you wanted taints that were really granular, like don't schedule GPU workloads on me, but you can still schedule other stuff on me. That wouldn't work.
Right.
But it might be a reasonable medium that avoids writing new controllers. I don't know.
I don't think we would need to write a new controller. I think we could extend node controller to achieve option 3. I see this as like pretty similar to option 3, but an alternative user interaction with some restriction on option 3.
Yeah, so options to the existing node controller, those options could be on the node object itself.
Right.
I'd have to think about it, but that seems like it might solve the majority of the use cases we have for this, assuming we get an ACK on using conditions for stuff like this. Okay, well let's move on. But yeah, the more I think about it, the more I think that might be a good direction.
I'll send an email out.
Okay. You can tell Vish I'm sorry. I'm sorry for making his life hard.
Yeah, I'll forward that too. So this is me again. I am having difficulty tracking specific subprojects in the main repo. I talked to Paris about some suggestions. The suggestions that were presented were to start playing around with projects and see if they're the right fit, or use area labels. And I wanted to see if anybody else had the same issues that I was having, or and if they had any experience with tracking these issues related to specific efforts. This is one that I spun up yesterday to just play around with the feature. I think I probably should have just did it for token request and not had a container in retrospect. But yeah, I just wanted to get feedback and see if people were struggling similarly.
Yeah, I know we've done umbrella issues for a few things. Those are really useful for kind of getting a picture of what we're wanting to do in a particular release, and then like what got done and what got moved out, and then kind of having a chain release to release to release. Audit has done a pretty good job of that. Pod security policy has done a pretty good job for the past couple releases.
Right.
There's always like a triage step, right, where new issues come up and have to get tagged or linked in. Labels are nice for that. I don't know how much leeway we have for adding lots of labels or like really specific labels to the repo. That kind of gets unmanageable. I don't know, what have other people found for kind of keeping track of issues and polls and proposals related to an effort?
Maybe we're still in the experimentation phase.
Yeah, I'd be curious what Tim's thoughts are. Like, I know the two things he was working on had the umbrella issues, and from the outside, I really like those. Those were helpful for me, like to be able to see what happened.
I'll try that. I'll experiment with both and see which ones people start using.
Okay. As far as like sub-projects and efforts, since 1.11 is wrapping up, I think probably our next meeting would be a good time to walk through what we're planning to do for 1.12, and specifically who is kind of taking lead on the different efforts. And so maybe getting some of those umbrella issues set up between now and then would help clarify like what the next steps are, what we're hoping to accomplish. Yeah, the token request stuff is probably the thing that is most ready to progress. Like a lot of the designs are done and understood, and a lot of the implementations are like 3/4 of the way done. So that's a big one I'm looking to see happen, and then hoping to drive to closure some of the node restriction stuff finally in 1.12. Those are so Mike, I don't know if you want to put together an issue for the token stuff, and I'll try to put one together for the node restriction stuff. Are there other, and then like the audit proposal and the I'm trying to remember, there was one other proposal, I guess a scheduling policy one. It's hard to tell where those are going to be for 1.12. Just we're trying to make progress on those, but as far as like concrete next steps, reach agreement on what this should look like is a kind of important first one. So if I am recalling correctly, I think this made it onto SIG Architecture's backlog. Dynamic auditing proposal is on the future agenda items. It would be good to figure out where the decisions about like what policy looks like are going to be made. Is that in the policy work group? Is that in SIG architecture? I saw the meeting time for SIG policy, or the policy work group just changed to one that is during business hours. So that's at least business hours in the US. So I was happy to see that. I'm hoping more people can make it to that.
Do we technically own the admission control framework and admission controllers? Or is that just shared?
I think the mechanism is API machinery.
Okay.
So different SIGs own different admission plugins. So we own like node restriction and service account, and probably the ones that are used for like limiting labels and tolerations and selectors and things. Storage owns a few. So API machinery owns the mechanism, and then individual SIGs own specific ones.
My understanding was working groups don't own code, so they would need to find ownership in an actual SIG.
Yeah, and it's even fuzzier than that, because it's really like, here are 5 proposals and we want to be coherent in how we express policy across them. Let's agree, and then scheduling is going to go off and write their policy, and we're going to manage our auditing policy. And so it's reaching agreement on like an external facing approach.
I just added one last minute that I wanted to get people's eyes on.
Okay.
This was some deficiencies in flex volume and CSI that are specifically motivated by using flex volume and CSI to inject overlay identity systems onto Kubernetes. So this is a brand new issue. I thought it would be interesting to get some people's eyes on it. So I just wanted to make you all aware of it. Maybe you can go read it offline.
Yeah, I think CSI had the initial implementation had started just at the persistent volume level. I know Clayton and Saad had been talking about some of the inline stuff, and it was on their radar, but not at the top of the list. And I think they are actually having discussions about like, callers of the CSI interface being able to pass in workload specific information, so that if you did an inline CSI volume, when the kubelet goes to mount it, Kubernetes calling CSI could pass in like the pod spec or the pod object, and some other cluster calling CSI could pass in workload specific things to their environment. And if the CSI plugin was doing specific things for Kubernetes, then it could pay attention to those parameters. And if not, then it would just ignore them. I think that was the direction they were going. So
that was one issue. The other issue was currently all plugins go through the attach-detach controller, which is unnecessary and actually hampers availability of these things for volumes that really should just be node local volumes, like the empty dir volume with some interaction to the daemon set. I think that was the other major issue faced. So figuring out how to cut attach-detach controller out of the loop for some of these node local volumes.
Okay.
Cool. That's it.
All right. We have a few minutes. Does anyone have any other topics? If not, we can get a few minutes back. All right. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.